At my father-in-law's funeral, I was the only one not given a meal after the service. Though, why is there a complete stranger at this table? My mill, hosting the event, said that as she obviously tilted her head. This is my husband's funeral. You, who are no longer of any use, have no right to eat. Now, move along. You don't have a seat here, so just go away. She, who always harassed me, seized this moment to laugh at me. That's terrible. My father-in-law and I were very close. Besides, I was the one who took care of him all by myself. Then, my husband stood up. That's right. A complete stranger has no right to be here. What? Ignoring my confusion, my husband glared sharply at someone. Mom, I'm talking to you. What? My name is Nana. I'm a 29-year-old housewife. I got married 4 years ago and now live with my husband and in-laws. My husband is an only child and was always adored by his parents, who often expressed their wish for us to live with them even after we got married. Initially, my husband was worried that I might be against living with his parents, but I agreed. My husband is a reliable person who stands by me, and I had a good relationship with my father-in-law even before we started living together. But honestly, I've always found my mother-in-law difficult to deal with. It wasn't so much the typical mother-in-law and daughter-in-law relationship I disliked, but more so my mill's personality itself. To put it simply, she's selfish, lacks empathy, and is always concerned about herself. When the topic of living together came up, my father-in-law was considerate of my feelings, but my mill had an arrogant attitude, as if it was only natural for us to live with her. She even treated my father-in-law with the same coldness, sometimes going as far as hurling insults at him. There seemed to be no love between my parents-in-laws. The only time my mill changes her attitude is with my husband, her son, whom she adores excessively. However, I was concerned about how she treats my husband, who is already a working adult, like a child, almost like doting on a pet. Until now, there hadn't been any significant harassment, so we managed to live together somehow. But then, something happened that changed everything. My father-in-law fell ill and became in need of care. Fortunately, he recovered enough to be discharged from the hospital, but he was left with severe paralysis and couldn't live alone anymore. When the doctor talked to us about his future care, my mill openly frowned and muttered, "What a hassle." As expected, she insisted on putting him in a care facility. Her reason was, "I'm too busy to bother with caregiving." Hearing this, I couldn't help but think bitterly to myself. She doesn't work, just goes to lunch with friends, and browses designer goods online. How is she busy? My father-in-law had a sad look on his face, but he said, "I don't mind being in a facility." However, my husband, who was very close to his dad, strongly opposed the idea of a care facility. He even said he would take care of him if it came to that. But my husband has a demanding job with a good income, which often means late nights. So, we discussed it and decided that I would quit my part-time job to take care of my father-in-law. My selfish mill, at her son's request, and knowing that I would be the caregiver, reluctantly agreed to home care. So, we remodeled the house for accessibility and brought in a special bed, starting our caregiving life. When I talk to close friends about it, they say, "Caring for your father-in-law must be tough." I couldn't do it. Indeed, it's physically demanding, but caring for my father-in-law has been enjoyable for me. We had a good relationship even before he needed care, and our conversations are comfortable. Even after he fell ill, his mind was sharp though his body was immobile, so we could talk as before. His life, starting a business on his own when he was young, was full of remarkable stories, like something out of a biography, and he shared many tales of bravery. He was also an avid reader, so he often shared interesting trivia with me. With his life experiences, he listened to my troubles and gives me advice. Caring for my father-in-law was much more meaningful than working part-time. Most importantly, unlike my mill, he was a person of character and often thanked me for my daily care, saying, "I'm sorry to trouble you, thank you always." Though I was often confused and exhausted by this new caregiving experience, my husband helped as much as he could. Thanks to that, I gradually got used to this new routine. However, in contrast to my devoted care, my Mill, his own wife, didn't take care of him at all. She lived as if he didn't exist, seldom even entering the room where my father-in-law was. Far from being helpful, my Mill would hurl abuse at my father-in-law and make snide remarks to me. Do as you please with the caregiving, but please refrain from talking. It's noisy. All I could do was look down and apologize. Once, when I accidentally dropped a bag containing waste in front of her, it caused a huge commotion. How disgusting, dirty. How can you handle someone else's waste? Don't you dare touch anything in the house with those hands. I'm sorry, I'll be more careful. That's why I said he should have been put in a facility. At one point, my Mill even said, while my father-in-law was sleeping, I wish he would just disappear so I can get the inheritance sooner. I was shocked to hear such a statement. It was bad enough that she didn't take care of him, but her verbal abuse was going too far. I was deeply relieved that my father-in-law hadn't heard her. He was used to the cold treatment from my Mill and never once spoke ill of her. Come to think of it, I've never heard my father-in-law speak badly of anyone. It's a mystery how such a kind man ended up marrying someone like her. My Mill had mentioned wanting the inheritance, and according to my husband, it seems my father-in-law's estate is indeed quite substantial. Though he had already sold the company he founded, he apparently still had savings and stocks. The thought of my Mill getting her hands on the wealth my father-in-law worked hard to build made me sad. As days passed, the snide remarks from my Mill towards me increased, eventually turning into outright harassment. One day, when I went to the dining table for dinner, there was no meal set for me. While her place and the spot for my husband, "You would soon be home," were properly set, there wasn't even a bowl at my place. Where is my portion? When I asked my Mill, she said something unexpected. You should eat the same care meals as your father-in-law. That suits you. Her spiteful look and condescending tone made me clench my teeth in frustration. Overwhelmed by the indignity, I decided to prepare my own meals while caring for my father-in-law from the next day. My husband noticed the situation and confronted my Mill, but she refused to listen. Unapologetically, she continued to badmouth me to my husband, justifying her actions. My husband's attempts to talk probably felt to her like a pet barking. He, too, was almost giving up on changing my Mill's behavior. The harassment continued. Once, I had no choice but to ask my Mill to care for my father-in-law for a day. I had a friend's wedding to attend. This friend, with whom I've had a close relationship for over 20 years, was like a best friend to me, and I had been looking forward to the wedding since hearing the news. Plus, being immersed in caregiving, I was excited about the chance to go out and enjoy a festive occasion. As I expected, my Mill flatly refused to take care of my husband for even just one day. No matter how much I explained the situation and begged with my head bowed, she just shook her head. I really need to attend. I've been asked to give a speech on behalf of the friends. I don't care about that. You expect me to take over caregiving just because it suits you. How selfish can you be? It's appalling. Who's the selfish one here? It's her own husband she's refusing to care for. Though I argued in my mind, voicing it would only worsen the situation. I had no choice but to reluctantly back down. I suggested hiring a visiting caregiver, but she refused, saying she didn't want strangers in the house. I realized that asking my Mill for anything was futile. Unable to give up on attending the wedding, I consulted with my husband. His response was supportive. I can leave work a bit early that day and take over. After all, we're doing home care because of my request. Thank you, that really helps, but I need to leave the house by 10 a.m. That's tricky. I have an important meeting in the morning. It might be just Mom alone for about 3 hours. I've been feeling unwell frequently lately, so I'm worried. While I was pondering, my father-in-law surprisingly said to me the next day, "Go to the wedding. I'll be fine alone for a little while." He showed a thin smile on his emaciated face. Apparently, he had overheard my conversations with my mill and husband from his room. If something really serious happens, my wife will surely take action. Saying this, he slightly lifted his left hand, the only one he could move a little, and showed me the home nurse call button. A mix of gratitude and guilt swirled inside me. After a moment of thought, I expressed my thanks and decided to attend. "Thank you, father-in-law. I'll stay at home as long as possible before the time." However, I was unaware that this conversation had been overheard by my mill in the next room. On the day of the wedding, as I was getting ready, I realized my dress, which I had checked the day before, was missing. I only had that one dress, and without it, I couldn't go to the ceremony. Frantically, I turned the room upside down, but it was nowhere to be found. It seemed impossible, but while checking the living room, I found my mill looking down at me with a malicious smile. "Oh, what's the matter? Looking for something?" Her expression and words confirmed my suspicion. She had hidden the dress. Anger welled up inside me, and I confronted her. "Stop joking around, give it back, I'm running out of time." Taken aback by my unexpected assertiveness, my mill momentarily faltered. Then her eyebrows shot up in anger. "Don't be ridiculous, blaming others for your lost things. You're the worst daughter-in-law. You were trying to push his care onto me, weren't you?" Her words made me realize she had overheard my conversation with my father-in-law. As this absurd drama unfolded, the time for the ceremony was drawing near. When I pay attention to the clock, my mill then said something even more outrageous. "I'm going out to lunch with my friends, so take care of the house, will you?" And with that, she left the house. I stood there, stunned. She had said she had no plans for today when I asked earlier. She must have made plans just to avoid even a short time of caregiving. I collapsed to my knees, overwhelmed with frustration and sadness, tears streaming down my face. Even if I'm going to buy a dress now, there wouldn't be enough time. And I couldn't leave my bedridden father-in-law alone, even for a short while. This was the one thing I had been looking forward to. Alone and in despair, I continued to cry. During these trying times, the inevitable day arrived. My father-in-law's condition worsened, and he was rushed to the hospital, where he soon passed away. Standing before his remains, I cried, "Ugh, it's too sudden, father-in-law." Since starting the caregiving, I had grown even closer to him, coming to think of him as my own real family. There were times when I was tired from caregiving and acted harshly, but my father-in-law always accepted it with kindness. There were still so many stories I wanted to hear from him. My husband, too, seemed profoundly shocked by the loss of his father, who he had always admired. Although he controlled his emotions at the hospital, once home, he cried alone. Still, he took over the funeral arrangements, which my mill, who did nothing, should have done. On the day of the funeral, I was surprised by the large number of attendees. Considering his character, and the fact that he had run a company, it was perhaps to be expected. My mill, the chief mourner, spoke words of sorrow in her greeting, but they seemed utterly devoid of genuine emotion. Come to think of it, I hadn't seen my mill looking sad at all since my father-in-law's death. On the contrary, she even seemed relieved and made no attempt to hide it. It was clear she was looking forward to the inheritance. Living in the house without my father-in-law and with my mill made me feel incredibly uneasy. Still, I decided to spend the day remembering my father-in-law. The funeral proceeded smoothly, and after the cremation, we were led to a room for the post-funeral meal. My husband and I moved to the family seating area. Then, I witnessed a shocking scene. There was no post-funeral meal set for me at my seat. The empty space on the table, where only my portion was missing, conveyed a strong message. Based on my past experiences, I instantly understood the situation and glared at my mill, who was already seated. "What does this mean, mother-in-law?" Without any attempt to hide her intentions, she blatantly stated, "Well, now that the caregiving is over, you're no longer needed." She wore a devilish grin. "This is my husband's funeral. You, a complete stranger, have no right to eat here." Laughs. Saying this, she began to laugh crudely, without regard for those around her. My anger reached its peak. At that moment, my husband stood up forcefully and looked down at his mother, declaring, "From now on, you are a stranger to me too." She gasped in shock. My mill was frozen in surprise. What kind of joke is this? It's no joke. I intended to cut ties as mother and son after today. Goodbye. She widened her eyes, speechless. She seemed unable to comprehend the situation. After a moment of being stunned, it seemed she finally realized my husband was serious, and she began to panic. Why is this happening? This makes no sense. You must have been influenced by that woman. Do you not realize what you have done? My husband took out a voice recorder from his bag. You might not have noticed, but Dad had been recording your abusive words. As he pressed the play button, the recorded voice of my mill filled the room. You're so stubborn, just hurry up and die, you're in the way. Not saying anything back, how dull can you be? Are your nerves dead? I can't wait to get my hands on your wealth. Laughs. One after another, terrible words came out. My mill's face turned pale as she listened to her own voice. Also, Mom, or rather, you, won't be getting much of the inheritance you were looking forward to, unfortunately. What do you mean? Why? She stood up, increasingly agitated. My husband, with a cold voice, began to explain. In fact, my father-in-law had asked my husband before he passed away to make sure that most of the inheritance did not go to my mill. A formal will had already been prepared with a lawyer. It was difficult to completely eliminate the spouse's inheritance, so the amount my mill would receive was minimized to the legal minimum. On the other hand, as a token of gratitude, my father-in-law left a substantial inheritance to us, his son and daughter-in-law. The voice recorder was also my father-in-law's idea, given to him by my husband. I had a vague idea about it, but chose not to probe further. My husband then pulled out documents related to the inheritance from his bag, and presented them to my mill. I never intended to reveal this in such a setting, but I've reached my limit. My mill slumped, her face still ashen. Not only was she disowned by her son, but she also couldn't inherit the amount she had anticipated. Though it was a result of her own doing, it must have been a considerable shock. My mill, in a daze, wandered out of the venue. Afterward, my husband, acting as the chief mourner, rearranged the post-funeral meal, and somehow the funeral concluded successfully. The next day, after finalizing the inheritance procedures, the lawyer handed us an envelope. On the back was my father-in-law's name. I was asked to pass it on to you guys once the formalities concerning the estate were satisfactorily completed, said the lawyer. Inside the envelope was a letter of gratitude from my father-in-law. It appeared to have been transcribed by the lawyer, but the kind words written were unmistakably his. Since he passed away suddenly, I never imagined receiving his words of thanks in this way. As we read the letter, we were overwhelmed with emotion and sadness. My husband and I, with tears in our eyes, read the letter over and over again. Afterward, my husband and I decided to leave his parents' house. With the money my father-in-law left us, we plan to build a modest yet lovely home. We're expecting a child next year. It's a pity that we couldn't show our child to my father-in-law, but we plan to raise them to be someone he would be proud of. Thanks to my husband and father-in-law, I got a happy life. As for my mill, abandoned by her son, she apparently squandered the small inheritance she received due to her usual spending habits. Having always been supported by my father-in-law, she's unable to work, and now seems to be living in poverty alone. Inspired by my father-in-law's character, and also learning from my mill's example as a cautionary tale, my husband and I vowed to always care for each other, no matter our age.